Morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tyson Choptain. I'm the Executive Vice President and Virtual CIO at Bravi Networks, and I'm joined today by John Martinook, our Manager of Security Services. And today we're going to talk about how to improve your cyber insurance application. So whether your company already has cybersecurity insurance or is applying for cybersecurity insurance for the first time, a lot of the items we're going to talk about today have either already been something you may have dealt with in previous cybersecurity insurance applications, or you may not have dealt with them before and it will come up when it's time to apply or renew. We have seen certain industries be targeted for a higher level of scrutiny than we saw in the past, and we are seeing the insurance companies tighten up the restrictions and requirements and or the riders or conditions that go on their cybersecurity insurance as they have been paying out a higher amount of payouts to customers that have been compromised. So we'll go through all that. We'll talk about some of that. We are using Microsoft Teams today to do this presentation, as probably everyone knows because you're now in it. You have the ability to chat with us real time during the presentation via the chat button. If you would like to do any live reactions, you can certainly do that. And if you want to ask a question, don't hesitate to request to be unmuted, and we can have an actual dialogue conversation as a part of the presentation. We will have time at the end for questions, but if there's a question that you have along the way, don't hesitate to ask. This is meant to be a very informal presentation. The PowerPoint is just really to make sure that we cover all the important concepts, not a us talk and everyone listens. If we can make this a dialogue, that would be fantastic. So without any further ado, we'll talk a little bit about current landscape, what we see happening in the cybersecurity industry. There are changes that we've seen over the last few years. We are expecting more changes to come. We do have a partner that we work with in the industry who gives us a lot of information and feedback and helps us understand what's going on, both with applications and with payouts as organizations go through compromises. We're going to talk about what you need to improve your application, what the key elements there are. We're going to break that down into information security governance, an item that we wouldn't have seen in the cybersecurity insurance industry a couple of years ago, now creeping into mostly enterprise, but we're starting to see it into the upper SMB or specific business areas as well. Security assessments and training. We are now seeing an expectation of end users having a regular assessment or training as a part of, if not all, most cybersecurity insurance applications. Multi-factor authentication, two-factor authentication if you prefer that terminology, but some mechanism by which you are proving that your users are who they say they are when they're accessing your environment that's either in the cloud or accessing your on-premise environment remotely. And we're actually starting to see that extend beyond just end user access to a higher level of multi-factor authentication for administrator access and system access. Endpoint detection response, we'll get into this quite a bit, but there's obviously a significant difference between what we've seen in the industry for years for traditional antivirus, as opposed to real-time and monitored endpoint detection response solutions. Security information and event management, so SIM. If you're not familiar with SIM, it's taking logging to the next level. It's taking your logs, shipping them to a SOC, a real-time security operations center that is reviewing those logs for any potential security events that may have taken place or may be taking place in your environment. It's beneficial not just for helping to prevent security events, it's also beneficial for how we react, respond, and are able to remediate a security event when it takes place, because it gives us a very critical historical information. Hardware and software patching is a core requirement that we see on almost every application today. Backup, another one, making sure not that only that you have backup, but you have a backup that you're testing and a backup that's stored properly off-site. And just a word of note, if you have employees taking backup devices off-site today, just be aware that unless you've got it in your employment contract, those employees have no responsibility for that backup data as soon as they leave the building with it. So if you're going to have people taking home discs or tapes or some other form of backup, and you haven't specifically put that into their employee contract, they have no responsibility for that data. So why do we care about cybersecurity insurance? Well, we care because of cybercrime. And why do we care about cybercrime? Well, we care about cybercrime because it's become very scary. It is estimated that by 2025, so not very far away, it will be one of the largest industries in the world. It will be the largest criminal industry in the world, surpassing drugs, surpassing human trafficking, and it will be on par with financial services, commercial real estate, and ahead of food services, oil and gas production, auto manufacturing worldwide. That's how big an industry cybersecurity or cybercrime is. And when we call it an industry, it's a criminal activity to us, but for many of the people that are participating in this, they don't even know what they're doing as a crime. They think they are going to work every day doing a job that happens to be cybercrime in our country and in many countries around the world, but may not be in the country they're in or understood by those individuals that are doing it that it is. That's how large it is, and that's how much of it we see happening. Because of that, that's why we have seen premiums rising year after year. Cybersecurity insurance came out 2015. In some jurisdictions, it came out earlier. Some jurisdictions, it came out later. But around 2015 is when we started to see cybersecurity insurance show up in a significant manner. And the premiums were pretty low because the industry really didn't understand the risk that existed. And they thought, this is great. We're going to sell people these policies. They're going to pay us a bunch of money. We're not going to have to pay out anything. And that's definitely not the way it's been. They've been paying out a lot. And so they've been raising the premiums to the point where the premiums have now almost tripled from what they were in 2015, and the coverage is dropping. So the premiums are going up. What they're providing in the coverage is reducing. And what you're seeing in many general insurance policies now, and this is worth checking, if you don't have cybersecurity insurance and you've renewed your general insurance, your general business insurance in the last couple of years, double check your general business insurance policy, because most of them now have a bunch of exclusions for what would only be covered if you had cybersecurity insurance. So you may think, well, my general business insurance will cover me because I have business interruption insurance. Well, I can tell you most business interruption insurance now has an exclusion that if that business interruption was due to a cybersecurity event and you don't have cybersecurity insurance, then your business interruption insurance is not provided. So you have to look at your policy and make sure everything's being covered based on having or not having cybersecurity insurance and what level and type of cybersecurity insurance you have. What we have seen is we would recommend you get your general business insurance and your cybersecurity insurance from the same broker, because they should be making sure that those two policies play nice together. In best case scenario, you get them both from the same provider. But we have seen cases where customers have general business insurance and cybersecurity insurance, and they each have exclusions for each other that don't line up well. So that is something to consider as well. But premiums are going up and the costs are going up. And they're going up because the cost of recovery goes up and the payouts that the industry has had to make has increased. Premiums have risen. The cyber insurance market loss ratio is much higher than they expected it to be. It's been going up on average 25 points a year. And in the last 2 years, it's gone up an average of a little less than 20%. So it's just extreme increase in payouts by them. Therefore, prices go up. Prices go up, coverage goes down, and ability to meet the requirements to be able to get it is getting more and more complicated. So here's a good chart that shows us an aggregate of standalone and packaged cyber risk. So we actually saw that the industry actually dipped a bit in 2018. The risk level went down, and then with COVID, it shot back up because as COVID hit the world, we saw cybercrime rampant as part of COVID's activities. People working from home, a lot of companies scrambled to go remote. They didn't put the right security in place, and a lot of organizations were compromised because they didn't have the proper remote security in place. We see, generally speaking, in our industry, managed service providers that aren't taking action about cybersecurity. We're seeing an 80% increase in the premiums they're paying. I'm talking the premiums we pay. So just to give you an idea, this hits us too. We have extremely high cybersecurity insurance costs because of what we do. The managed service providers that aren't doing the right things for their own cybersecurity protection for their organization have seen over an 80% increase from their 2022 premiums. Managed services providers like ourselves that have gone through our own CIS assessment, we've done our own CIS remediation, we've spent tens of thousands of dollars ourselves on protecting our organization that therefore helps protect our customers. We've seen less of an increase, and we've actually done enough that we've seen even less than a 40 to 50% increase. We actually only saw a 27% increase in our own premiums based on the security protection policies, solutions, and prevention mechanisms that we put in place at Broadview Network. So just to say, we're not just preaching this because we think it's a good idea. We've lived it. We've eaten the cost of it. We understand it doesn't help the bottom line directly for a business, but it's critical because if you don't do it, the impact on the bottom line could be destroying that bottom line altogether. So what do you need to do? How do you make sure that you are in the best possible place, either when you go to apply for cyber insurance for the first time, or when you go to renew your cybersecurity insurance? Likely what's going to happen is you're going to get a questionnaire. Back in 2015, those questionnaires were 1 or 2 pages. We've seen questionnaires now that are 20 pages, and they want not just you to say yes or no to what you have, they want proof. So a couple years ago, it would be yes, no. Do you have MFA? Yes. Do you have endpoint detection response? Yes. Do you have backups? Yes. Okay, now give us proof. Give us evidence that you've done backup tests. Give us evidence you have MFA in place. Give us evidence. Screenshots, printouts, reports, they want all that information. We had one customer that we recently helped them with their cybersecurity application. They originally refused. They hadn't done any security assessment or put much security remediation in place. We did an assessment for them. We helped them remediate a lot of their cybersecurity gaps. They then did their application. And in that application, I think we had to provide about 10 pages of evidence of proving that we had those pieces, those components in place for that customer that was important. So, insurance questions that we see. One of the ones that we're starting to see now is an identification of responsibility for IT security within your organization. How many employees are dedicated in an IT security role? And depending on whether you have or don't have that, or whether you have someone external doing it, there may be subsequent questions that come from that. And how many years have you been in that position of either having or not having someone responsible for cybersecurity? And then do you comply with any recognized information governance or cybersecurity standards? John, you want to talk about what the right responses are for the customers for those areas?
Will do. Thanks, Tyson. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, it's really key to have that oversight and realizing some organizations have no IT. Some organizations may only have 1 or 2 IT resources. So it's really a responsibility beyond IT or a shared responsibility with IT. So having a part-time or partial or virtual information security officer is really key. They're going to guide what do we need to do? What's the priorities? What are the gaps? And put in plans to address those while thinking about the long term, while putting the pieces together and really keeping that oversight in place so it stays on track, whether it's cyber insurance requirements, regulatory requirements, right? They're going to guide you in that right direction. Part of that is other managed security services. Managed security services could be as simple as patching. They could be as complex as quarterly assessments, review tasks. It's really important that, like IT, right, security is not just one time. So in a managed recurring basis, we want to be doing things like scanning for vulnerabilities, monitoring logs, creating alerts, etc. Backing all of that are policies and procedures. It's no longer hey, this is a good idea. I read a news article, or here's a checklist on the internet. You have to select a framework, which we'll talk about more, and back that by policies and procedures. You'll hear it throughout the presentation and particularly with the training, right? Security is everyone's job. It's everyone's responsibilities from board to users. So they need those policies and procedures to direct people in the right direction.
Yeah, thanks, John. I can't emphasize that enough. A lot of business owners, boards, senior executive look at security as an IT operational responsibility. It's important that we start changing that mindset because it is not an IT responsibility by itself. It is definitely an organizational responsibility. And at the end of the day, if everything goes wrong, it's the senior executives that are the ones that are going to have to answer to the customers, to the board, to the press about what's happened and why it's happened. So there we go. Senior executives need to be aware, and they need to have the security services and understand if the oversight is in place. I don't expect your senior executives to be in security experts. That's not their job. They're experts in what they do well. But they need to be making sure that there is an oversight expert involved, providing that oversight of whatever services you have, whether it's being delivered by your internal team, whether it's being delivered by people outside your organization. Someone inside your organization needs to be providing that oversight and reporting that back to the senior executive on a regular basis. Have you done a security assessment? Do you know what your gaps are? Do you know where you're strong and where you're weak? Do you have policies in place? Are those policies current? Do they align to any sort of a security standard? How would you know what you need if you're not aligned, pardon me, to some level of a standard? And what are you doing for security training and security awareness for your users?
And as mentioned, right, it's just really key that everyone is in the know and involved. That training, particularly for users and high profile users like CXOs and other executives that might handle money or other financial decisions, right? HR information. People need to be reminded and trained on a regular basis. That training has to occur at higher and at least once a year. Recommended, certainly more often, even quarterly. And that training should be on relevant topics, topics that are going to help people protect themselves and their data and the company. Scanning. We'll talk more about vulnerability scanning. The cyber insurers are actually doing scans against you as part of the application process. So if you haven't done your own, particularly an external vulnerability scan, they're going to do one for you. And I understand why they do it, but it's really important. They don't have the internal context that you have or your IT team would have, right? They're going to do a vanilla scan and get a report without that context. So a lot of companies that have, for example, remote access, they don't have context around, hey, our remote desktop is protected by multi-factor. The insurer just sees company X has exposed remote desktop. That's bad. Already a mark against you. So if you're not scanning, these providers are going to do that before or as part of your application process. Similarly, testing, programs and services and servers, we have to test our users. Not only do we need to train our users, keep them in the know, give them relevant examples, provide them with current threat information, we actually need to test them. We'll talk about it more in a later slide, but phishing is still one of the main entry points of attacks. So we should be quizzing, testing users on a regular basis, ideally quarterly as well.
Yeah, and I want to just add something to that. There's a difference between security awareness training and phishing testing. Training is properly understanding the different security risks that an end user has in your environment. Phishing is just checking if they know how to recognize a bad email. That is not the only risk your organization has. So we have seen companies answer the question on cybersecurity response because they have a solution like KnowBe4 in place, and it's doing phishing testing and then remedial training on users that fail on their phishing test. That's not enough for some security insurance providers anymore. They want to know that you've taught your users about malware, about websites, about SSL certificates, about security beyond just phishing. Phishing is important, don't get me wrong. It's how a lot of people get compromised, but it's not the only way. So there's a question about which security assessment framework we recommend. We leverage CIS. So we as an organization have standardized on CIS as a security assessment framework. The reason we've standardized on CIS is we like the fact that it's not tied to a specific country. It's not tied to a specific purpose like ISO, which is generally tied to manufacturing. It's not tied to a specific industry, and it's done by cybersecurity professionals all over the world. So you're getting experienced professionals from all over the world recommending what security items are the most critical and secure for organizations to understand.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And the key point is in a perfect world, we'd have this regular cycle of assessing, remediating, and validating. That's a perfect world. Often the security conversation is starting with an incident, which is unfortunate. But if you're able to perform an initial assessment, regularly re-review those items on an ongoing basis, remediate items, and then validate, those safeguards and remediation are actually working, that goes a long way in improving your security posture and being more preventative than reactive.
One of the other things we really like about the CIS assessment framework is it maps to almost all the other popular frameworks. So we can do an assessment in CIS, but we can give a customer output in NIST or in ISO. So if there's a reason you need it in that format, so we have customers in the transport industry. We did an assessment in CIS. We gave them output in NIST because they needed that as part of their secure transport requirements for the U.S. Department of Transport. I don't remember the exact terminology for it, but we were able to give them the necessary information in the format they need. And CIS, you can self-assess. You can do that. You can go and get the CIS framework. You can go and do the assessment yourself, and the mapping information's there. So that's one of the things we like about CIS quite a bit. Multi-factor authentication. So most people are familiar with multi-factor authentication because of banking, because the banking industry, brought it in for web-based banking probably before a lot of other industries did. Other people might be experienced with it through Amazon or other online shopping that they do. And we try very hard to never put Microsoft 365, Exchange Online, or those services in place without multi-factor authentication. And that's a common area that most organizations are used to it, is with cloud-based services. What we're starting to see now is the cybersecurity insurance providers wanting multi-factor authentication for any access into the on-premise environment as well. So as John mentioned earlier, whether it be remote desktop access into a remote desktop PC or a server, or it be VPN access. Basically, if there's any access into your environment from the outside, or any access to anything you have in the cloud, there should be MFA as a part of that access security solution. And we have customers now that are bringing MFA into their regular inside the network on logging into all of their devices. And it won't be long, we don't think, before the cybersecurity insurance providers start pushing that. So they're going to start wanting multi-factor everywhere, because even inside your organization, the risk is high if Joe knows John's username and password and can log in as Joe, and then Joe's blamed for something and John's the one that actually did it. MFA is the only real way to protect that. And the ultimate MFA way to protect that is going beyond SMS text MFA and even beyond MFA application MFA solutions, and going to a USB key or like Windows Hello. So either facial recognition or thumbprint recognition as a part of that MFA experience. So we're seeing that MFA become used in more and more areas, required in more and more areas, and we're seeing the requirements and complexity of that MFA. Complexity may not be the right word, but the quality of that MFA increasing across the industry. We recently saw that Coalition has underwriting rules now that if account is under 25 million in revenue and they don't have multi-factor in place, they cannot get a funds loss transfer endorsement. So they will not get certain levels of cybersecurity insurance within their cybersecurity application if they don't have MFA in place. So you could get refused, or you could get, an exclusion on your policy because you don't have it in place.
Yeah. Tyson mentioned some really key points. Well, it's MFA everywhere. It's not bulletproof. So the strength of that MFA is really important. I mentioned phishing earlier. Phishing and remote desktop being exposed publicly are still the kind of the main entries for attacks, particularly ransomware. We, you know, COVID changed a lot and remote access changed absolutely, but there's still very good ways to protect remote access, multi-factor being one of them. And even going back to basics, right, is if you don't need it, don't expose it, right? Carefully consider what you're exposing. In a perfect world, nothing would be public exposed. That's not how business works. So if you do, only turn on what you need and protect that by multi-factor and with a higher strength of multi-factor. Text, phone really aren't bulletproof. Authenticator apps are a good middle ground, but where we're going, as Tyson mentioned, really is passwordless or using physical tokens like a YubiKey or other brands of tokens. I mentioned it a few times. Phishing is still the #1 common cause form of cybercrime. Um, Phishing is easy to do. There's many solutions out there that allow bad actors to start a targeted phishing campaign. So we want to, as mentioned, right, train users on detecting phishing attempts, use strong multi-factor, and apply it, wherever you can today.
Yeah, we have had a customer compromised because at 3 in the morning, someone was woken up to their phone buzzing. It was their MFA app asking for multi-factor authentication. They clicked approve and went back to sleep. And by 9 o'clock that morning, that account had been compromised. And luckily, it didn't do too much damage within the organization. But the multi-factor authentication apps, the SMS text-based authentication methods, they are far from bulletproof. They involve humans, and humans are not bulletproof. And SMS can be compromised in a variety of ways. So, the biometric token method is what we're going to see more and more organizations and cybersecurity insurance providers requiring and switching to. Endpoint detection and response. So antivirus software is something we've talked about for years. We've understood it very well. Everyone understands you need to have antivirus software. But what antivirus software, traditional antivirus software, didn't do is it didn't deal with 0-day. And I mean, we all lived through this with COVID. If you thought someone was sick, you sent them home. Or if they had a certain set of symptoms, you sent them home. Well, current antivirus, not the modern antivirus or traditional antivirus, doesn't do that. If it doesn't recognize that threat, it can't block it. It can't do it based on symptoms. It can't do it based on anomalies. We want to move away from just signature-based protection to anomaly-based protection. We want to apply to computers what we applied to our offices during COVID, where we think this might be doing something we don't like. We don't like the way it's acting. We don't like the symptoms that are happening on the computer. We don't like the way this application or this function is presenting. Let's do something about it and let's block it and let's, do action about that computer or computers that are being impacted by it. And not only should you have modern endpoint detection and response in place, you should have it monitored. Someone should be reviewing it. It should be sending alerts. And it's a good thing that it's sending alerts. And you should be monitoring those alerts to understand whether a low risk event, a medium risk, or a high or a critical event has taken place on one or more users or systems in your environment. And endpoint detection response starts to, transfer over into identity protection at a certain point as well, because, computers don't get attacked and companies don't get attacked generally. People get attacked. So it's the person's identity that gets attacked, and that may impact the computer they're on or the applications they're using, and therefore the customer, the company they work for. But it's really endpoint detection and identity protection, they really are starting to come together and need to be a cohesive solution for both. So a lot of the modern endpoint detection response solutions, they tie into identity protection.
Particularly with new threats, right there. A lot of threats are not known. So it's really key to focus on behavior, anomalies, and react that. A really good endpoint detection and response tool is going to include automation, so automatic response, for example, isolating a machine if it's doing bad things, and it's going to be monitorable, which isn't great English, but the ability to monitor not just machines, but identities, accounts, and more is really key to bring all of that together, particularly if you have to do an investigation. Like patching and like antivirus, defense in depth is still really key. There's not a one solution fits all, right? We still need to layer on our security. So having a good endpoint security product, training users, monitoring, right? They all go hand in hand and need to be done together. Just to touch more on the number three from the previous slide in monitoring, you know, IT folks, leaders, right, need to sleep at night. So you really should have a service that is monitoring your logs and servers, endpoints, et cetera, on your behalf. Having a security operations center have eyes on 24/7, 365 is really key. It's going to help you identify issues quicker. It's going to help you react quicker, and it's really going to limit the damage that we'll talk about a bit more.
Yeah, and a SOC, a security operations center, can be leveraged just for endpoint detection response, and that certainly is going to up your security protection game from where you're at today if you don't have that in place. But you're also going to see a SOC usually tied with any sort of a SIM you have. And if you're going to have a SIM solution in place, you want that SOC in place as well. And in a perfect world, you want your endpoint detection and response SOC and your SIM SOC to be the same. So all the logs of all the security related events from servers, firewalls, workstations, our identity are all coming into one central uh, source or site that's taking in all that security event and incident potential risk, and then one SOC that's reviewing all of that. That's very powerful, both from a protection and prevention perspective, but it's also very powerful, again, as I mentioned, from a remediation perspective. One thing you will not hear us say that any of these items, solutions, recommendations are going to stop an organization from having a cybersecurity event. Again, long ago in the industry, we moved away from if to when. And so it's when you're going to have a cybersecurity event. How bad is it going to be? How well are you going to understand it? How quickly are you going to be able to remediate? The more of these solutions and tools you have in place, the better your protection and remediation is. And therefore, your cybersecurity insurance is going to have a premium that relates to that, because the more protection you have in place, the better chance you're going to have of getting cybersecurity insurance or having a better premium rate for when you do get it, because you have these protection mechanisms in place. So cybersecurity insurance can be a great reason, or a reason to go to executive and say, listen, if we put these cybersecurity solutions, protections, prevention methods, and policies in place, our cybersecurity insurance policy is going to be better and it's going to be more cost effective. The other benefit is your lives are just going to be better, because you're going to have either less chance of risk or a better way to remediate from it. And so, do you have someone monitoring? What steps are you taking to detect and prevent attacks?
We talked about that auditing and logging, and I don't like the term perfect world, but sure, it'd be great to log everything, keep those logs for a long time or multiple number of years. But that logging and monitoring really has to start with what is critical, right? What are the critical pieces we need to monitor? And then based on regulations, et cetera, how long do we keep those logs for? So you, for example, might want to monitor your firewall and servers that hold sensitive data and keep those for a year. Very common example. Part of that logging and monitoring is looking at the network as well. So yes, you want to be able to detect threats against your accounts, against your endpoints or laptops, et cetera. You also want to look at network threats. So that there's a couple different pieces to that, but it's really important, as I said, to log and monitor the right pieces as opposed to everything. We alluded to it in having these tools. The more tools or more effective tools you have is going to mean quicker detection and faster response. Those both mean less time for bad actors to sit in the environment and either do bad things or prepare to do bad things. In the industry, it's called dwell time. In some of these attacks, the bad actors are in environments for months, years before someone notices and reacts. We want to prevent it, ideally, but in the middle ground is, if somebody's in, I'm going to know about it as soon as possible.
Yeah, and in the ransomware example, you want to find out when they start putting the mechanisms for ransomware in place before they activate the ransomware. And that's critical. We have seen a difference in customers that have, endpoint detection response and SIM solutions in place. That type of activity being recognized in the network before it goes active and actually preventing the ransomware from being able to spread because they were able to lock out the bad actor before they were actually able to trigger the ransomware. Obviously, if you have ransomware trigger, good backups, good remediation is going to be your recovery method. But if you cannot have to recover, that's even better. Hardware, software, and patching. I mean, you need to be patching your operating systems and your applications. Every line of code, maybe not every line, every application out there has vulnerability in their lines of code. There is risk in every application, including operating system that you utilize every day. Patches are the only way to, shore up those vulnerabilities that the bad actors know about.
We talk about the basics, and we still need to talk about the basics, right? One of the other benefits of CIS is the CIS security framework has 3 groups, and those implementation groups start from the basics that will protect you from the most common attacks and moves you to medium and advanced topics in protection. Patching operating systems, patching your browsers and Office suite. Those are really basic things that we've done for many years. Unfortunately, some companies still aren't doing that or aren't automating it or aren't doing it, regularly enough. So basics like patching, strong passwords are still very important.
Backup. So, whether it's cloud-based solutions or on-premise-based solutions, most of us are very comfortable and aware of how we back up any on-premise data that we have on our servers, off-site backups, having that information available, doing test restores. But have you understood, thought through your requirements for your cloud-based systems and data? We've now, over the last couple of years, as more and more customers have moved to more cloud-based solutions, not Microsoft 365, for example, but application vendors that have gone and turned their what was an on-premise solution into a cloud-based solution, and they move to the cloud-based solution, and then we start working with that company. We go, great. What's the backup for that? I'm like, I don't know. Well, what's their disaster recovery? I don't know. It's theirs. It's in the cloud. They're just going to make it happen. Well, that's great, but if they're not available, you can't access your data, you can't do your work, and your staff can't do their work. You need to make sure that not only you have the right backups and best practice in place for the systems that you monitor, manage, and maintain, but also for the services you're getting from others. So,
Yeah,
some basics, John, if you want to review those, that'd be great.
you bet. Yeah, really, really key is our backups, just like servers, users, right? They need to be protected themselves. So whether it's technical safeguards like encrypting your backups or physical, like having backups in more than one location, it's really key that we have more than one safe location for that backup data. Tyson touched on cloud backups. For example, Microsoft 365, though everyone in the world uses it, it's fantastic. There's no backup built in. So you have to consider other cloud services and protecting them, like Tyson mentioned. And really, really key is when it's crunch time, can you restore that data? So you really want to make sure you're doing regular backup and restore testing, not just of files, but of emails, applications, and more.
And I use the term backup, and we use the term backup for this presentation because generally on most of the cybersecurity questionnaires, they'll put the title of the section will be backup, but it does get into disaster recovery as well. And so in our minds, when we're talking about backup, we're always thinking backup and disaster recovery are one. They're part of a complete solution. You back up your data to be able to recover from it. So your backup solution should be a disaster recovery solution, and you should have understood, documented, and tested how you're going to recover from different type of loss events, whether it be an accidental deletion, whether it be a purposeful negative activity someone did for malicious purposes, whether it be because of a cybersecurity event, all of those types of reasons for why you may have a disaster. You're more likely now to have a disaster because of cybersecurity than fire, flood, or other natural disaster. Much more likely. Before cybersecurity was anywhere near the concern it is today, 10 plus years ago, we talked about fire, flood. In Winnipeg, Manitoba, we mostly talked about flood or power outage as your largest, long-term disasters. We don't even worry about those items anymore, to be honest with you, very much, because you're so much more likely to have a cybersecurity event. So backup, offsite disaster recovery, ability to know exactly what point you can get to when something happens is critical to the organization. So those are the 7 items that we've seen, I would say most consistently over the last 2 to 3 years. In the last year, we've seen some additional items come into play. And one item that we've seen is, how much are you spending on cybersecurity? And do you anticipate spending more, the same, or less? And when we first saw this question come up, we were like, okay, what's that going to do? We actually talked to the broker partner and we've actually seen policy premium rates change based on whether the organization has a committed plan to spend on cybersecurity prevention or not. How many employees are dedicated to the role in IT security? So we talked about that one a little earlier. That's a more recent one that we've seen in the last year and a half, 2 years. And budget. You need to have a budget for cybersecurity. If you don't have a line item in your operating IT budget or whatever budgeting your organization does today for cybersecurity, you should be putting one in. If your organization doesn't budget your IT, even if you don't budget IT, budget cybersecurity. You should have a cost factor expectation per user per month or per year of what cybersecurity should cost. In a mature IT model, you understand what your cost per user is for licensing. You understand what your cost per user is for infrastructure. You should understand what your cost per user is for cybersecurity. And that's going to be determined by what level of cybersecurity protection you want to commit to as an organization. And so, as John mentioned, when you do an assessment, we'll score you at different levels, IG level 1, 2, or 3. Your per user cost of cybersecurity at IG1 is quite a bit lower than your per user cost at IG3, but then your risk and protection is higher at IG3 than it is at IG1. So those are all things that need to be considered. We also see questions about third-party technology providers. So those cloud providers, managed service providers. If you have managed service providers in your organization today, you should ask them what their cybersecurity protection, prevention, assessment capability is, what they've done for themselves. Have they scored themselves? Are they remediating? What are they doing? There's a questionnaire that we can send out to you that you can send to third parties for them to answer questions about, what their cybersecurity standards should be. And it's important. In CIS 7 and earlier, John, correct me if I'm wrong on this, you could self-attest as to the cybersecurity capabilities of a third-party provider that's providing you services. Now in CIS 8, you have to prove it. You have to get information back from them saying what their cybersecurity policy or profile is. So make sure your providers have their security house in order. And that may be a factor in deciding who you work with. Your Users may want to go with application or hosted application A because it looks pretty and has all these great features. But you might do your investigation on the two they're investigating, A and B, and you might come back and say A is a security risk. We cannot put that in front of our organization long term. So that needs to be an important consideration. So the questions you should be asking any external providers: do they have cybersecurity insurance? What security credentials and certifications does their security team have, or are they contracting out for? Are they doing ongoing training and testing of their staff? Do they provide internal communications for? What security compliant frameworks do they adhere to? And sorry, John, realized you were supposed to be delivering this one. Do they have MFA? If you're using a third-party service and it doesn't have MFA, I would say you shouldn't be using it because you're just putting your organization at risk.
Yeah.
And I know that's a rough statement to make because we have a lot of customers that are using hosted applications that don't even have MFA as an option, because a lot of application providers that moved from an on-premise model to a cloud model haven't even thought about adding MFA as a part of their solution. And then, do you have written security policies that align to your security framework? And my question is not going to be not only do they have the policies, do they have their users attesting to those policies, which is critical as well. John, some new trends to talk about.
You bet. And just a couple points about a few of the previous slides. That plan, so that budgeting process and that plan, if you go to a cyber insurer and say, hey, we did a CIS assessment, we have this remediation plan, they're going to recognize two things. They're going to recognize that you're using that globally recognized framework. Insurers know CIS and NIST for the most part. And that effort to show improvement by X date may get you further in the application than not doing anything at all. On the multi-factor front from that previous page, Tyson made a good point. You've trained your users, you've gone through the effort, you have a tool, you've given multi-factor to administrators, you've given multi-factor to users. But if you don't enforce that multi-factor with third parties or contractors, that's a pretty significant gap. You can give everyone in your company MFA. That one supplier you don't give MFA to is going to be the source of the breach, generally speaking. In terms of new trends, we talked a lot about protecting accounts and identities. We talked about protecting servers and system and endpoints. Now we're seeing a more focus on the actual data itself. So if you're processing, storing sensitive data, how are you preventing it from leaking external? How are you classifying it? Would you even know that data is sensitive? So classification generally is about labeling documents. For example, very generally, what's a publicly viewable document versus an extremely confidential document? You want to apply labels to those and classify them, and then have actions based on those labels. Hand in hand with that is loss prevention. So from an external perspective, you want to make sure those confidential documents are not being leaked outside via chat or email or other methods like Teams. We keep saying MFA everywhere, but this is a reality now. MFA should be placed in a perfect world on servers. So the insurers are looking for, do you have MFA protecting server logins? Do you have MFA protecting the administrative logins for networking equipment? For example, a firewall. Ideally, you would have multi-factor protecting the firewall admin page. If not, a bad actor maybe could go into that firewall and create rules that open you up for risk. And as Tyson mentioned earlier, in some ultra secure environments or companies that really do provide sensitive data, they're looking for MFA or passwordless or something like Windows Hello on logins to users' machines themselves. So that demand is growing quite quickly. And frameworks. Insurers really want to see that you are following globally accepted guidance. That could be one framework, that could be many, and mapping between frameworks. But more importantly, as Tyson said, they want evidence. You follow CIS, okay, well, show us your assessment, show us your plan, and for what you've remediated to date, give us evidence. That ask is really, really crucial and is turning these applications into 20, 30-page documents.
So just to recap, the top actions that are, going to be critical for this, establish a security program with policies, whether the cybersecurity insurance application requires it or not. Having a security program within your organization and having it backed up by policies is critical to cybersecurity actually taking root and properly functioning within your environment. Get oversight on your security program. Get an assessment done. Focus on the gaps. Get those gaps filled in as soon as possible. As John mentioned earlier, before you apply for your cybersecurity insurance or your renewal comes, do an external vulnerability scan. We have seen people refused because of an external vulnerability scan that showed, which was essentially nothing that mattered. But in all fairness, the cybersecurity insurance industry aren't fantastic at reading those vulnerability scans. They run them, they see stuff, it's just noise, but they see a whole bunch of noise. They go, okay, there's noise, we can't protect you. So we've had to help some customers through that. Remove excessive administrative privileges. This isn't one you'll necessarily see on the applications, although we have seen this on a couple now as well. But go through your admin privileges of your users and make sure old users or users that are no longer active or accounts that are no longer active don't have admin rights, but make sure people only have what they need. Go to a least privilege model. MFA everywhere. Train your users regularly. Don't just test them, train them. Train them and then test them, because testing without training usually isn't going to get people very far. And then strengthen your posture with, modern advanced endpoint protection and monitoring. Put that modern advanced endpoint protection response solution in place with a SOC that's monitoring it. Those are top actions we can recommend, whether you do cybersecurity insurance, get cybersecurity insurance or not, just to better protect your environment. Thank you. So that's everything we wanted to cover. Please, if you have questions, don't hesitate to type into the chat window to ask any questions. And if you want to ask a question live and have more of a conversation, please raise your hand and we can turn your microphone on. And if you want your camera on, and we can have a dialogue.